Hey guys, Kizgan here. So I figured now is a good time to revisit my 1v1 arena tier list with the new balance patch having been out for the past few weeks. It's definitely changed up the meta. It's definitely changed up a lot of civilizations and their viability on this map. So I figured now was a good time as any. Unlike my previous two iterations of tier lists for 1v1 arena, I'm just going to be doing two things different. One is just I'm going to be sticking to one video this time. Just going to try to condense my commentary down a little bit even further. And I'm just going to add the civilizations one by one in their respective tiers. Just giving brief commentary afterwards, creating it live, more or less. So let's get right into it. So S tier, once again, the civs that I consider to be just the best overall for arena. And number one on there is going to be Teutons. I mean, it's probably no surprise. Teutons were not affected by this latest balance patch as far as I'm aware. And so that means they kind of just dominate arena still. They have an amazing boom, amazing monks, an incredibly strong late game, and with their very tanky infantry, their tanky paladins, their tanky siege, their great monks, their defensive structures, crenellations, castles, bombard towers that really can help them secure that map control and basically hold on to it forever and just push from whatever position they got into their opponent's base and just completely wipe them out. I'd say their only real downside is maybe the one point of the game where they're maybe a little bit mediocre compared to other parts of the game is probably early Imperial Age. I mean, it's not to say they're hopeless in early Imperial Age, but I think it's fair to say that's where they're kind of slow and kind of sluggish, because the Teuton late game, it's powerful, but it's also expensive. So, you know, for a lot of civs, kill Teutons in early Imperial Age or basically you die. We can just put it that way. So, really great arena civilization, and they'll probably be number one for quite some time. Number two on my S tier is going to be Byzantines. I was a little hesitant at first, thinking if this civilization should be in S tier or maybe they should stay in A tier. But I think at this point, I think they have a rightful place in S tier. Maybe you can make an argument that they shouldn't be second, but I still think they are definitely worthy in S tier. They don't have a very particularly strong economy, but they can still have a nice timing for things because of the cheaper Imperial Age that they have. 33% discount, and their tech tree is just so big and so flexible it allows them to counter just about anything in the game. Their discounted trash means that they have and their camels means that they have really good answers to the archers, the discounted skirms, and the cavalry with the discounted halbs and the camels. So they're just very well built for dealing with a variety of different army compositions and a variety of different civs. And what I think pushed them over the top was the fact that it wasn't in this patch, but in a previous patch, or one or two patches ago, where the elite cataphract upgrade and a logistica upgrade was made a lot more affordable. And so even though it's still going to be an expensive unit to tech into, and it's probably still going to take some time, the unit's just a lot more accessible, and it's going to mean Byzantines are going to be a much more threatening civ to, say, infantry reliant civilizations. Think along the lines of like Aztecs, Slavs, Celts, that sort of thing. Number three on my S tier, we have the Turks. So Turks is one of the civilizations that has definitely received a big change with this recent patch. So their light cavalry line has received one additional pierce armor, starting from the Dark Age. Their Dark Age scout actually has more pierce armor and just carries throughout the game for the light cav. It synergizes really well with their free light cav and Hussar upgrades, which can really function as function number one for the Turks is as a meat shield for their gold army, whether you're going gunpowder or cav archers. It's just that meat shield. But I think now that they have extra pierce armor, their secondary purpose, or possibly even primary now, is being used to put pressure on like very archer dominant civilizations, because that traditionally has always been Turks' weakness. Their reliance on gunpowder, which is just like a very slow firing, very inaccurate unit type, meant that they were kind of weak to very strong archer civilizations, because archers fire a lot more quickly, a lot more accurately, and they can exploit like gunpowder units, like relatively low pierce armor, things like that. And so Turks would have otherwise died to, say, civs like, Britons, maybe Ethiopians, Mayans, things like that in early Imperial Age. But now that they get the extra pierce armor on their scout line, I think that can definitely give them a much greater fighting chance than they had before. And on top of that, fantastic late game otherwise. Cav archers are amazing. Their gunpowder is top notch. Bombard towers and bombard cannons that have ridiculous range. So just guess their only downside really is the fact that they're still kind of gold reliant. So their philosophy is always get your gold units out quickly and basically keep them alive forever. Put down like 90 farms, spam a Hussar meat shield from like 15-20 stables, kind of like Hera style, endless Hussar spam in the late game. Just keep a constant meat shield up front of your ranged units and just keep them alive forever. That's kind of like the philosophy of Turks. Number 4 in my S tier is going to be Aztecs. So, I mean, you guys probably know my opinion of Aztecs. I always thought they were probably a little bit overappreciated, even before the changes that they received with this patch. And it's another civ that has received changes. Their eco bonus was effectively cut in half, where their carry capacity bonus was reduced from +5 to +3, and that really does a big number on their farmers, especially because that's always been the biggest recipient of that extra carry capacity bonus, the biggest beneficiary, I mean. So they're not going to be quite as overpowering as they used to be with regards to the economy, and also from a previous patch, their military, their ability to create like a mass military is also going to be stunted because their creation speed bonus was reduced from 15 to 10%. But I mean, Aztecs are still overall going to be very strong. You just have to be mindful of their weaknesses. One is the fact that their post-stimp with gold, as well as the post-stimp trash war phase of the game, are two areas where this civ is really going to suffer. They don't really have the most powerful and pop efficient army to look forward to, and their extreme gold reliance too, as well as reliance on melee units. Like if you think, for example, Turks, they're also very gold reliant, but they're also tend to be fairly ranged unit heavy, so it's easier to keep their army alive compared to the melee gold unit army of Aztecs. And also the fact that you're always against a lot of different civs, you're just going to feel like you're on a clock with a civ. Civs that have like comparable infantry or especially heavy cavalry options, because that is what kills Aztecs in late imp, because they don't have halberdier. You're just on a big clock against those kinds of civs. And now that their creation speed bonus and their economy has been seriously reduced, you're going to be put on an even bigger clock against those kinds of civs, unfortunately. The plus side, though, is the Jaguar Warrior did get a creation speed boost from 20 to 12 seconds base. I always thought that the creation speed, that slow creation speed for a melee infantry unit that the Jaguar Warrior had, was just absolutely ridiculous. 9 times out of 10, whenever I saw Jaguar Warriors being employed trying to fight against infantry, it's the infantry from the opponent that would actually counter the Jaguar Warriors, because the production speed was just so terrible on them. But now I'd say that's going to be a lot less of an issue. So I think overall there were changes for the better. Probably nerf overall, but I think this definitely does make Aztecs, I think, more of a balanced civ overall. Still very good, just not as good as they used to be, but still good enough for S tier in my opinion. The last civ in my S tier is going to be Malay. I was really debating on whether to put Malay in A tier or to keep them in S tier. And that's just because I really don't function well with the civ I like taking map control and like playing with map control strategies, and the Malay, the way they play out, it just doesn't feel very friendly towards that strategy. Your faster age up bonus does mean you will have a better economy overall, but because it takes a while for that to kick in, and because you're going to be hitting Castle Age with a lot fewer resources at that point in time, you know, making army and for taking map control, keeping up villager production, and grabbing ecotechs to try and just keep everything running, it's just going to be so much more difficult with Malay because of that resource deficit. And also their late game, not particularly impressive. You're lacking a lot of pop efficiency, although you still do have the potential for a lot of different types of countering, except maybe for like very strong, very fast kinds of archer units like cav archers, or like the very strong arbs from civs like Britons or Ethiopians, things like that. But overall, I mean, you still do have some decent counterplay, and of course, you can't forget the Force Levy two-handed swordsman spam that can just outright end games in post-Imperial Age when there's no gold left on the map. So I'd say it's still a good civ overall. It's just not one I would personally play. Like, this is actually like I said, last civ in my S tier. And when I'm putting my A tier together, I'll go so far as to say that I would personally prefer to play all the civs that I have in my A tier before I actually play Malay. I just put Malay in S tier because I think, you know, personal opinions aside, I think professionally speaking, they are still a very strong arena civilization, even if I personally would not like to play them a lot of the time. So going into the A tier now, again, these civs are almost as good as the S tier, just a couple of minor things, one or two minor things that tend to hold this civilization back, but otherwise they're still pretty solid. Lithuanians, so first civ in my A tier, definitely been relegated to the tier below them because they received a pretty big nerf with their lightest now getting one less base pierce armor than they used to from the last patch, and this means the unit was admittedly pretty busted. I'm not gonna lie. Even their supposed like weakness to, like, say, good archers, like good ranged units, it wasn't that big of an issue considering, you know, 6 pierce armor in post-Imperial Age is still pretty damn good, and 150 HP obviously. And of course, you know, you have those extremely tanky skirms with tower shields that can just kill almost most archer units in the game that would be able to threaten the lightest. But now I'd say you definitely have to be even more cautious of that. If you're fighting a civ that has like really good archers, maybe you can default to paladins in that situation. Maybe reserve the lightest for situations when you're going to be facing a lot of very high melee armor stuff, like some like Slavs with Boyars, Teutons with like Teutonic Knights or their tanky infantry in general, maybe like Bulgarians with their Baganes, two-handed swordsmen, things like that. But still, I think Lithuanians are still a very nice civ on Arena. Amazing monks, you have gunpowder access, you have a really nice start with your extra 150 food. Your late game is incredibly solid. Guess you're only really held back in the mid game because you don't have the greatest eco bonus. You don't really have much of an eco bonus at that point, and you're kind of reliant on your relics to kind of carry you. If you don't get yourself the relic advantage, then the civ can feel a little bit lackluster, but still, you know, you still do have lots of options in the late game that you can take advantage of. So overall, I'd still say they're a very strong arena civ, just not as strong as they used to be. Second on my A tier, we have Incas, a civ that, you know, my favorite Native American civilization. Even if I do, like I said, like in previous videos, even if I do, from a professional's perspective, I consider Aztecs to be the better arena civilization overall. Incas are not that much further behind. Their eco isn't as good as, say, Aztecs, their most natural kind of like comparison, but they have a much easier time with countering. Like, you can throw just about anything at the civilization and you'll be fine. The only army composition I'd say that can truly like hard counter Incas is some combination of heavy infantry as well as heavy siege with heresy. Anything short of that, and you're gonna be grinding it out against Incas, because they have counters to everything. They're infantry civs against infantry civs. You have slingers, you have arbs, and your like Kamayuks, even their unique unit, which is also good against cavalry, but also serviceable against most infantry units because they have that one range. And cavalry civs, Kamayuks again, fully upgraded halbs, and against archer civs, siege rams, 10 pierce armor eagle warriors, fully upgraded skirms with Andean sling. You just have a very good answer against most things in the game. I'd say there's going to be another civ that's coming up in my A tier that I think Incas actually do counter very, very well, possibly even hard counter in the late game. But second on my A tier, that's definitely where I'll put Incas. Third on my A tier is Britons. Most people who are like either skilled with arena and just maybe top players in general who have created arena tier lists, like for example Hera, would argue that Britons belong in S tier. But I personally never only really consider Britons to be S tier during around the time of DE's release, when melee unit pathfinding wasn't that great. But now that it's pretty much been fixed, Britons I think will proportionally suffer compared to your typical civ, and I think they're better relegated to A tier. They have a really nice start, the faster shepherds, really nice mid game boom with the cheaper TCs, but the problem, and really nice early Imperial opening with 10 range arbs, but you're just lacking a lot of pop efficiency in the late game. Like foot archers just don't really carry a civilization in post-Imperial Age when you're facing a lot of civs that have very pop-efficient answers. So think like heavy siege civs, like Ethiopians, Celts, things like that. Those guys are way more pop-efficient than Britons. Paladin civs like Franks, Lithuanians in just right above them can also just end up completely steamrolling Britons if you're not careful. It's the kind of civ that, because their late game army just isn't very pop efficient, you rely on having a critical mass in order to be able to make up for that. In my experience, the second that a civ like Britons takes a bad engagement, you've basically lost the game. Take 10, 15 paladins, or 10, 15 siege onagers, or just siege units in general. Compare that to 10, 15 longbowmen. There's way more things that you can do with 10, 15 paladins, or 10, 15 siege onagers than you can with that number of longbowmen. So Britons can be a very tricky civ to play, and if you have great micro, and if you're very confident that you're able to keep your ranged army alive, then you can probably make a case for S tier. But I just think it's just a little risky for me. I mean, I'd say my micro is okay, but still, whenever I play Britons, I do kind of feel that looming sense of danger. If I take a bad engagement, things are going to snowball out of control, and I'm probably going to lose the game. So for that reason, and for the melee unit pathfinding being vastly improved since D's release, I'm going to put them in A tier. Next up, we have the Slavs. This is the civ that I actually considered Incas to match up very well in post-Imperial Age, and I'll get into that soon. But first, their upsides, amazing economy. They're farmers, even though they're a bit slower than they used to be back in the Wool of Kingdom days. It still makes for a really nice eco bonus, and you have some really great military options. Possibly the best infantry in the game in mass in late game, or at least top 3 easily. Champs and House with Druzhina, Boyars, which have been improved. They have a lot more bulk. Now they have more pierce armor. It can be situationally, I think, a very nice unit. Amazing monks, nearly full siege workshop that, of course, the siege units themselves obviously being discounted, cheap siege onagers, cheap heavy scorpions, and siege rams can provide a lot of great support to your melee-based army. That's really helpful considering the Civ's archery range is pretty damn bad. Their biggest downside, I would say, their two biggest downsides is probably they're much like Teutons up in S tier, because these two civs, in my opinion, have very similar playstyles and go for very similar kinds of units in the late game. You're kind of sluggish in early Imperial Age. Your eco is great, but again, it's just your late game army composition is really, really pricey, both to field as well as tech into. So you still do need some time in order for your late game to come online. So if you're facing a civ that's really strong in early Imperial Age, you could get pressured out before you can get that late game up and running. And so that's probably the window of time where you can really punish Slavs. And also the lack of heresy is a big problem, in my opinion, for a civ like this, when that operates on using very expensive units. Siege, even if it's discounted, it's just a fundamentally expensive unit type. And if you're losing them to conversions, and besides the resource swing, because conversions is basically a 2-to-1 resource value exchange, you also open up the possibility of getting a ton of damage dealt to your army. And I recently saw a thing from the 2v2 World Cup on an arena game where some guy playing Aztecs, I don't remember the players, the guy playing Aztecs converted a Celt siege onager, one Celt siege onager that went too far forward. It got converted, and then it just fired. The dude deleted the SO, and it flattened 7 more SOs. So that's the kind of that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, and that's the kind of situation you wish you had. You really wish you had heresy, and unfortunately Slavs don't have that, and so that's just a devastating loss if that happens. So those are the two main downsides to Slavs. What keeps them from being absolutely dominant, in my opinion, but it's still a really solid civ overall. Of course, like Incas having the great monks, obviously countering the Slavs' best options, along with like the slingers, the halbs, and the kamyuks. That kind of army composition, I think, is just very difficult for a civ like Slavs to deal with. But overall, like I said, very good civ. Fifth in the A tier is going to be Franks. Again, it's a civ that is really good at taking map control, a playstyle that I really do enjoy, and is more or less like the meta of Arena these days, kind of contesting map control, getting yourself relics, try and get yourself a late game advantage. Franks are very well suited. Franks are very well suited to that because of their tanky scouts and light cav, and possibly even knights. And their cheap castles also provide a very nice defensive tool if you're getting pressured, or also a nice offensive tool if, let's say, you secured the map control after going your scouts and knights. You drop a few of those castles forward and kind of get to imp, treb your opponent down, and you'll have the treb war advantage against a good majority of civilizations because your castles are cheaper, and so you can build a lot more of them. Your late game is great paladins, you have gunpowder access, solid infantry, as well as including the throwing axeman unique unit. Your monks aren't that great. Your archery range is near bottom tier outside of the hand cannoneers because you miss so many upgrades. But that can be a problem if you're facing some certain civs with certain army compositions. So like I'd say the composition that Franks really would have to watch out for is either like, for example, like camels plus ranged units like arbalests or things like that, or things like, halb, like siege onager monk, or like halb, arbalest, bombard cannon, these kinds of civs that can be really tricky for Franks to deal with because this civ depends on a lot of gold for its army, and if you're spending a ton of gold on, let's say, your knight line, and your trash isn't super great to support it, then you have to kind of support it with other gold units like your throwing axemen or like your champion, like heavy scorpions, bombard cannons, things like that. Yeah, Franks are a fairly gold dependent civilization as a result of that, and they can run into some problems there. But I still do like the civilization a lot. It has some very good strengths, nice boom, nice late game, nice ability to take map control, and that for me is more than enough to put them in A tier. Next up is Spanish, number 6 on my A tier. I still think it's a pretty solid civilization. It is a shame that conchs have been nerfed quite a bit now that they get the Cav Archer armor class. But I mean, still, if you're still pushing with things like conchs and like mangonels, as well as a lot of like conchs and rams, it can still be a super dangerous unit to be fighting against in the late game. In the mid game. Some civs, especially civs that don't have like a very good like ranged unit options, really will struggle against Spanish in the mid game. Think like Franks right before them. They specialize in a lot of melee units, like knights and things like that, which obviously will just die to conquistadors in the mid game. And so if a civ like France is getting pushed by a civ like Spanish, like a full gunpowder push, they're gonna suffer, as well as some other civs. Like for example, Celts down here, also very bad with the ranged units and just not suited to deal with things like gunpowder in the mid game. Your late game is great. Your late game is all similarly fantastic, similar to the Franks. A bit more diverse, and I think a bit more well-rounded, but maybe a little less powerful overall. You got your gunpowder that fire faster. You got fully upgraded infantry, fully upgraded paladins, fully upgraded trash, which is a really nice asset if the game goes late and it goes into a trash war phase of the game. Your villages are also super tanky with supremacy. You have bomber tower access. You have siege rams. And so, yeah, you have a lot of variety in the late game, but you could potentially get pressured out by civs that have some very strong ecos, because the Spanish eco is kind of generic. So maybe in those situations, you might be more forced to go like more aggressive, which Spanish are fully capable with their conquistador and siege push when that's necessary. And they can also kind of boom it out to the late game against most civilizations, because they have that big wide open tech tree available to them. So overall for me, Spanish are still good enough to be an A tier for me. Definitely been relegated to A tier from S tier from like my previous tier list though. Ethiopians is up next. I've grown to really like this civilization and its options. Just a very streamlined game plan, like their halberdiers, which are easy to tech into, their arbalests, which are very well known for firing faster. I nicknamed them the machine gunner arbs, as I think some other players do. They fire very quickly, have very high damage output potential. And of course, you can't forget the torsion engine siege, which is kind of like the mainstay of the Ethiopian army alongside their arbs. It's just the complete siege workshop, just gives you a lot of flexibility in that regard. Like arb, halb, torsion engine siege, it can just deal with so many different units and so many different civs in the game. So Ethiopians, I think, are very well rounded. You do have a little bit of an eco bonus in the early game as well. It's basically like a 400 resource boost between getting FCing. It can really kickstart a nice boom. There's still going to be probably stronger economy civilizations, but Ethiopians, I think, can still comfortably hold their own. And their only real weakness, downsides regarding, is like their monks aren't super great, their cavalry sucks, and they do have a bit of a weakness to like very strong and very fast infantry in the late game. But other than that, I think Ethiopians are great, and this civ I think should serve you very well in your typical arena games. Next up, second to last, is going to be Portuguese. Portuguese, they received a pretty significant change. Well, actually, possibly I would say maybe not the most significant, but I still think it's definitely helpful, especially on this map, where all their technologies were searched for 30% faster. Unfortunately, it does not affect age ups, but it does affect every other technology in the game. And I think that really can help the civilization that has like a fairly generic economy still be able to have like a decent early Imperial Age opening, because that's probably like where they were weakest, and now that they have this bonus, they can hold their own a bit better and be able to kind of snowball things to their very strong late game, where they have like very good gunpowder. You have solid infantry, though they miss squires, so they're a little bit slow. A reasonable cavalry. You have bombard towers, great monks, and so you have answers to, I think, most things, and you have a good power level overall. Where you might struggle with is maybe against very strong archer civs, like for example Britons higher up in the A tier. Yeah, Portuguese, they lack, I think, a lot of good strong options to be able to deal with units like that. But overall, I mean, they're not hopeless against them, but still, it's going to be something they struggle with. Again, their mid-game eco, much like Spanish, is going to be somewhat generic, so you could get outpaced by some stronger eco civs, but overall, I still think Portuguese are good enough to be an A tier. One thing I wanted to mention is that it always kind of surprised me is speaking with some like arena, some really top arena players. They have the situation like, for example, where they're put Spanish in A tier, but put Portuguese in like C or even D tier. And I personally just never understood that, because Portuguese and Spanish, in my opinion, just play out so similarly. They have great monks, relatively generic economy, and they both have gunpowder unique units that can lend themselves well to mid-game aggression, so, and a really nice diverse late-game tech tree that they can take advantage of in the late game. So it's just a minor little rant. I just never understood. I think maybe I can understand one tier difference between these two civs, but 2 or 3 tier difference, I just never understood that. So for me personally, I put them in the same tier. I think they're roughly the same power level at this point, and even before this recent patch, but I digress. Finally, in my A tier is going to be Burmese. Burmese are always going to have the issue of, it's a very polarizing civ because it can completely clobber most infantry or cavalry based civilizations, but then the civ dies to like most strong archer civilizations. So it's this really weird dynamic with the civ where you know, they're a Rambai unique units. It can be, again, really nice against like most infantry as well as most cavalry. And then you have your good options otherwise, like amazing infantry with their +3 extra attack you get in post-Imperial Age. Your great monks and great monk tech tree that you can take advantage of with your discounted monk techs. Your elephants, like second best battle elephants in the game. It's just, your archery range is just bottom tier. Your skirms are terrible, and that's ultimately is where, and the reason why this civilization will struggle against those really strong archer civs. But otherwise, I think Burmese, I still think, do have some really cool options. I think you can play with them pretty aggressively. You can boom with them. I mean, their late game isn't going to be the absolute best, but I still think it's fairly solid compared to some civs. So you can kind of pick and choose how you want to play with the civ most of the time. So I still think that makes them good enough to be an A tier. Going to B tier, so these are the civs that I think have more problems associated with them compared to the A tier. Obviously the S tier civs, but I mean they still can have like either really strong economies, really strong military options, and so you're far from hopeless if you go for these civs. But just be warned that you're gonna have areas in the game where these higher tier civilizations might be able to do a number on you. So first up is Saracens. Saracens is a really interesting civ because, you know, their eco is kind of generic, but especially these days, people have been, I think, more inclined to play around with their market bonus. So even though it's not a direct eco bonus, it can help you kind of get a better timing on things because your resource exchange rate is just so much better. So I've seen, for example, back in, I believe it was Clown Cup 3, it was between like Tato and Vodka in the quarterfinals, I believe it was, where Tato did a crazy fast uptime of like was like 25. Well, it wasn't crazy fast, but crazy fast considering the strategy he was going for. It was like a 25 plus 2 FC into like a 5 TC boom. And he had very few farms, and he just mass rallied a bunch of villagers to gold in order to be able to purchase food at the market, so he could kickstart his boom easier. And so, you know, you have fairly minimal loss because you can sell food later on once you've finished booming and get most of your gold back, you know, assuming your opponent hasn't market abused at that point in the game as well. So creative things like that, you know, and Taito obviously went on to win that game. So, you know, creative things like that, I think, could even potentially lead this civilization to being even an A or possibly even an S tier. But I guess I'm just considering overall, their eco is still going to be a little bit generic, but you do have tons of military options at your disposal. Amazing monks, infantry is okay, full archery range. You're some of the best camels in the game in post-imperial age. So you still do have some really good options. I guess maybe the biggest holes in your tech tree is probably the lack of halberdier, which can make dealing with civs that also specialize in camels, like for example Berbers or especially Indians, kind of difficult to deal with. But and especially no knight line either. So really strong archer civs could potentially give you a little bit of trouble. But overall, I think Saracens are still can serve you pretty well. They have lots of options, and I don't think they'll be struggling to counter most things, like most unit types in the game. Second is Japanese, a civ that I think is pretty underrated on Arena. Their military tech tree is nice and wide, and they also have a really nice start early on because you save around 200 wood with your cheaper camps and mills. It can really kickstart a really nice boom. The mid-game boom, unfortunately, is otherwise kind of generic. Especially because your cavalry is pretty mediocre because you don't have +4 defense, and the fact that you don't have the best siege in the world, it can mean that you're also a little bit susceptible to really strong archer civs. Like Britons up in A tier can, I think, really give Japanese a hard time. Like if they go for like a arbalest or longbow plus onager combination, that can be almost impossible for a civ like Japanese to engage properly because their cavalry is bad. You know, skirms will get flattened by onagers, not to mention outranged by the Briton archers, and Japanese don't get the best siege themselves. So it can be kind of unpleasant. But still, I mean, you have things like Yasuma keeps for getting and maintaining map control, great archery range, amazing infantry, especially halbs that can rip apart a lot of cavalry civs, amazing monks, and with that early eco, you can maybe go play around with monks like a smush, things like that. So they're still fairly versatile, fairly powerful, a decent power level still. So that's why I still think they're good enough to be in B tier. Next up is Celts. A civ that's definitely moved up some. I just thought about it. They were in C tier previously, but thinking about it again, I mean, Halb Siege is a composition that I really do like, and Celts do that very well. Although I'd say it's probably my least favorite of the kind of Halb and heavy siege civilizations, simply because I think the Celts can't support that combination as well as I think some other civs can. Like Ethiopians with things like their amazing arbalests that can complement the Halb siege, or like their torsion engines, bombard cannons. As I'd say, if your opponent's trying to use bombard cannons against your siege, then you have better bombard cannons with Ethiopians than most civs that you can use to kind of deal with an opponent doing that. Celts don't really have much in the way of like support of that. Maybe Woad Raiders, since they do move fast and they can snipe siege relatively well, but still, I don't think it's the same. I just don't think it's on the same level of like being able to support their siege and stuff. Otherwise, they're very weak. It's still going to be pretty weak in early Imperial Age because you can't buy time with anything outside of like their infantry and siege, and both of which are really expensive unit types to tech into. The Celt economy is pretty good with faster woodcutters, but still you're still gonna be kind of a sitting duck for a few minutes while you're trying to get that late game up and running. And so again, early Imperial Age powerhouse civilizations could potentially pressure the heck out of you, possibly even kill you before that late game can come online. So those are always going to be my concerns with this civ. But overall, I mean, great economy. Their late game is, it's narrow, but it's powerful in a lot of different situations. But I mean, so they're good enough to be in B tier. Next up is going to be Koreans. So it's a civ that has also received a change. Now they get archer armor upgrades for free. Even though it's not going to be helpful with regards to their booming, I'd say, well, one of the big issues with like Koreans is probably off the back of their very generic economy is a fairly lackluster early Imperial Age. But I mean, this civilization likes to play around with arbalests, like just ranged units in general, a lot in early Imperial Age when they're able to. And so the fact that they get archer armor upgrades for free, but some nice savings, and it can make their early Imperial Age not necessarily top tier, but I think solid enough that they can kind of hold their own while they get like their stronger options, like their Shingijeon SOs, like their strong towers and their war wagons, things like that, up and running. And so, and otherwise, you know, their wood discount bonus also really kind of lends itself well to that kind of like ranged unit play. And yeah, overall, really nice, like late game tech tree. They have a lot of power. You're gonna have to be careful playing the civ if you're facing like a civ that has really strong monks, because like Slavs up in A tier, Koreans suffer from the issue of you operate with really expensive units, but you don't have heresy. And unlike Slavs, your scout line is really bad. You miss bloodlines, blast furnace, and plate barding armor, so dealing with monks is not going to be nearly as easy for a civ like Koreans as it would be like for a civ like Slavs with that option. So aside from that downside and the fact that their eco is still a little bit on the generic side, I still think Koreans are definitely pretty solid, and I think definitely more than solid enough to be in B tier. Next up is Lithuanians, 5th on my B tier. Bulgarians, oh, did I say Lithuanians? Sorry if I did. I meant Bulgarians. Bulgarians is a civ that that was really put down by a lot of arena players that I knew. A couple I even know say they were like the absolute worst arena civilization, which I think is probably a bit too much to say. But because I still think the civ did have a lot of uses, like the free swordsman line upgrades meant that the civ could match up fairly favorably against like the Native American civs, because it kind of shut down any early eagle usage, and that kind of can help you kind of snowball things along. But now that I think they definitely have a firm argument for being at least in B tier because of their new bonus that they got. Blacksmith and Siege Workshop techs costing 50% less food. The savings is just crazy, and especially in like early Imperial Age, yeah, your boom is a little bit on the generic side, but I still think if you were to just boom and push with like Halb Siege, they have probably the most, for example, like the most accessible like Halb Siege Ram push in early Imperial Age, because Capture Ram upgrade is only 150 food, Siege Ram upgrade only 500 food, and so you can tech into that fairly quickly and just pressure the heck out of, like, for example, a lot of cavalry-based civilizations or things like that. And yeah, it's a really nice bonus. And of course, Siege Onager and Siege Onager tech is significantly discounted as well, and so maybe if your opponent's pressuring you with like ranged units in early imp, you can get a really quick and cheap Onager upgrade to be able to defend from that as well. You're still going to be a little bit weak, I think, overall to very strong archer civilizations. You miss blast armor on your skirms. The civ lost paladins. Conics are not bad versus archers, but they're not also that great because of their lower HP and pierce armor compared to the paladins that they lost. And so overall, you still have, and of course, their monks are bad as well as a generic boom. But I think overall, I think Bulgarians have enough strengths at this point that I think you can definitely make a solid argument for B tier. Like I always had them in B tier even before this patch, but that was probably like a controversial pick. I think nowadays with this patch, I'd say they're firmly in B tier. Next up is going to be Vietnamese. I've moved this civ up from C tier because having played around with them and also having seen them played around, I think they actually do have a lot of really good uses. Fighting against some other archer-based civilizations like Mayans and to an extent Britons, depends on how the Britons play things. The Vietnamese can match up pretty favorably because their archers are just so tanky, as well as the Imperial Skirm access. Their mid-game boom is actually quite solid. I wouldn't say it's top tier, but it's one of those bonuses that at the very start, it's maybe about as strong as the Japanese wood bonus with regards to the savings that you get, the wood savings you get. But as the kind of castle age kind of drags on, the Vietnamese economy is going to get incrementally stronger, because now you start saving resources on not just the techs you get at like the mill and the mining camp and the lumber camp, but also at the TC, wheelbarrow doesn't cost wood, neither does handcart, and so you can find you might end up banking quite a bit of wood as Vietnamese by the time you hit Imperial Age. Really nice early imp opening as well, nice arbalests, and you have bombard cannons as well, and halbs that and decent halbs and light cap that you can use to support your ranged army as well. This civ will still kind of struggle against halb and like heavy siege army compositions, and it's just unfortunate because those are the kinds of civs that I think really can shine on Arena. Like Celts in the same tier, Teutons in the other tier, and the S tier, I think can really end up giving a civ like Vietnamese kind of a hard time. But I mean, it's in a similar vein to like some other civs, like for example Chinese. Like if you're facing a civ that doesn't have the units that can potentially counter you, the civ feels very good. But if they do, the civ can feel a lot weaker as a result of that. But I think averaging it out, I think they're still can have a rightful place in B tier. Khmer is up next. Khmer, after losing BBC, I don't think are that impressive on Arena these days. Halb, if your civ has at least halb and like onagers with siege engineers, I'd say you have a really solid fighting chance against Khmer. Their reliance on their cavalry like hussars or elephants, as well as their scorpions, means that halb and like siege engineers, onagers, or even better SOs, I think can really do a number on the Khmer, because and also range units as well, like hand cannoneers, like arbalests, especially that arbalests, since you might be seeing them a lot in early Imperial Age, like halb and like halb siege can really just do a number on this civ. And also their monks are bad. Your boom is insane, but it's like one of those situations where it's like, what exactly do you boom into? So like facing like halb siege can just be very unpleasant. But I will say you still do have a fighting chance against these civs, especially if you have some solid micro. Your scorpions can match the range of most onagers and SO in the game. So if you kind of like space them out and kind of like pull them back when necessary and kind of charge your hussars at them, and then kind of maybe pull them back so that the defending halbs can chase after you and you can gun them down with the scorpions and kind of rinse and repeat. I'd say maybe it's like a more skill-based kind of thing more than anything, but overall I still like the halb and like siege civilizations better, and I think Khmer aren't particularly well suited to dealing with that. Also not particularly well suited to dealing with bombard cannons either, especially having lost bombard cannons themselves. Italians is next. They can have a nice start because they save quite a few resources with their cheaper advancing through the ages, and they can have a decent early Imperial Age potential because, again, you save a decent chunk of resources getting to Imperial Age. Your monks are great. Your archers are not top tier, but still, I think, pretty solid. Your cavalry is decent. Your infantry is decent, especially condos. They did get buffed, not with this particular patch, but they did get buffed at some point. Pavis now affects them. Their Castle Age unique tech. They have 1 extra attack. And so I always like using condos for pressuring very bad archer civilizations in the early Imperial Age. Think along the lines of like Burmese, kind of. I mean, if they went for a Rambai, it can get a little tricky. But like Burmese to an extent, Slavs, Franks, things like that. If you pressure with like condos and trebs, or like condos and cap drums and early Imperials, you can really mess these kinds of civs up. And Genoese crossbowmen, that was like the major change this civ received. It's now creates a lot faster, and it's a really nice thing too, because this civ otherwise I think would kind of struggle against really good cavalry civs because they don't have halberdier. So shortening the creation time on their best cavalry counter, I think is a pretty good thing overall. Your eco is still going to be a little bit generic. Your siege is really bad outside of the discounted hand cannoneers, the bombard cannons, which you and you also get discounted hand cannoneers because of that cheaper gunpowder bonus. But overall, I still think your tech tree is diverse enough, and you still have lots of options to be able to kind of help you out, even if none of your options might be like top tier individually. Next up is Cumans. Alongside Khmer, it's a civ that I don't think is particularly strong on Arena. I know a lot of people rate them very highly. Even like Arena players, like I know at least a couple of them who would even put them in S tier. A few that most I think would put in A tier. I personally put in B tier. The 2TC Feudal Boom, it's a very feast or famine kind of bonus. Because if your map is like really safe, you can probably justify doing it, because you'll have that safe stone access. Like if you're getting pressure, just get to a Castle Age, drop the defensive castle, and kind of to protect yourself. But if you don't have a safe map, like you have a lot of mineral resources forward, then it turns into a problem, because on the one hand, if you go for the 2TC Feudal Boom on a map like that, you open yourself up to a ton of pressure from your opponent if they're going aggressive, and they may likely want to go aggressive against you, because otherwise they're letting you get a big eco advantage for free. But if you don't go for the 2TC Feudal Boom on a map like that, then your civ has no eco bonus. So it's a very tricky civ to get right, and even if you do get it right, I'd say your late game options are not that impressive. Like, yeah, you have paladins, but outside of some very specific civs, paladins aren't exactly the greatest late game choice on Arena, except maybe if you're facing like a lot of ranged units, like archer civilizations. Your siege is okay, but not fantastic, because you miss siege engineers. You don't have gunpowder access. The Kipchak has been nerfed as well. They have a frame delay. They have a bit of a frame delay now. It's still a strong, unique unit overall, I'd say, but it's just not as strong as it used to be. And unlike what some people might argue, the unique unit doesn't scale well to Imperial Age when things get a lot more pierce armor. So I think it's a very like feudal age and like the Castle Age dominant civilization. Go much further than that, and I think Cumans will definitely start falling apart. So. And thankfully, they do have some options for going aggressive, like the ability to research capped ram in Castle Age, as well as the strong eco that you can take advantage of, assuming you were successful with the 2TC Boom. So you still have options, but I just wouldn't say it's a civ you want to take late. So you're put in a similar vein to like Aztecs up in S tier. You're kind of put on a clock. So just be aware of that and play accordingly if you're playing Cumans. Malians is the last civ in my B tier. It's got a lot of options, but they're not particularly strong, especially on Arena. Like if this was Arabia, I think Malians could easily be like SA or even S tier, because on a map like that where you're spending down a lot of gold, and by the time you're in Imperial Age you've already used up maybe half your gold, you're not going to be able to reliably get to really strong pop efficient late game options like siege onagers, like really strong heavy siege, or like paladins and things like that. But on Arena, where it's a lot more like eco focused, not having those options, I'd say hurts Malians a lot more than it would on a map like that. because their tech tree is open, but they just have so many noticeable holes. Like their arbalists, they have access to them, but they don't get bracer, so it's not as nearly as good of an early Imperial Age opening as it otherwise could be. Your cavalry get Farimba, so it benefits your entire stable, but you don't get Paladin and you don't get Azar, so it kind of holds it back in that regard. Your infantry gets high Pierce Armor as a result of their Civ bonuses, their extra Pierce Armor per age Civ bonus that they get, but they don't have Blast Furnace and they don't get Halberdier. So it's just a really weird like mishmash kind of civilization where they have like a lot of options, but they also miss a lot of things too. So again, I guess maybe it's in a similar vein to Cumans. It's not particularly well suited to the late game. So kind of play accordingly. Aim to kind of get yourself an advantage by, I don't know, late castle, early Imperial Age, so that you can kind of snowball your way to victory from that point on. Because if you drag it to the post-Imperial stage of the game against a lot of different civilizations, especially like the post and powerhouse civs, Malians are really gonna suffer. Let's come into C tier. The civs that I consider to be, they're not particularly bad, but they're not particularly good either. The nice thing about civ balance is that, a lot of civs are going to be concentrated in this area, like between A, B, and C. So I'd say maybe these three tiers aren't as far apart as I think they otherwise might have been, like from like say my previous tier list, and maybe even before that, my very first tier list. But needless to say, I still think there is a bit of a gap, and you will definitely notice it with these civs. But I still think you can do some things with these civs. You might have a really nice economy or like a really nice late game, so you're still able to do. You're not hopeless with these civs, is what I'm trying to say. You just will be outclassed at a lot of different points in the game and by other higher tier civilizations. So just be aware of that. Oh, not that civ. Magyars is first. A civ I think is also really underrated on Arena. Yeah, their eco is a little bit generic, but their ability to take map control, I'd say, is right up there alongside civs like Franks, because you get free attack upgrades, and that can make your light cav and like your scouts and your light cav just a lot harder to deal with in the mid game if your opponent is also trying to contest map control with like a more generic civilization. Your late game is also pretty nice with the recurve bows HCA. CA in general I think are going to be a lot more useful on open maps, but I mean Magyar HCA are just so powerful. I still think they do have a place on Arena, and they have an amazing complement with the Magyars, are the unit that you see on the Magyar Civ icon, because whatever the HCA struggles against, the Magyars can destroy. Like Skirms can threaten cav archers, but Magyars can just delete them. Siege, heavy siege, like onagers, siege onagers, like heavy scorpions, these can be a big threat to CA too, but Magyars have a bonus against siege, and so that's a nice answer to that as well. And so Magyars was what I consider to be the only civ that has the title of cavalry archer civilization that goes for heavy cav archers, that has a real fighting chance against like these halb and heavy siege army compositions that these kinds of civs would otherwise die to because of the access to the Magyars. Like if you're trying to snipe siege with like just regular Azars, like let's say your opponent had his halbs caught out of position for like 2-3 seconds, man, you might lose a couple of siege units, like a couple of onagers, siege onagers, things like that, if they're caught out of position, but you will still keep most of them. If you're caught out of position but with your halbs for 2 or 3 seconds against Magyar Azars, yeah, all your siege is dead. They just completely nuke siege, so it puts a lot more pressure on the halb and siege operator, like the player operating that army composition, to make sure they're always diligent with protecting their siege, because if they're caught out for a split second, their army just disappears. And the siege backing is gone, now the heavy cav archers can just pick off all the halberdiers very easily. So Magyars, underrated in that sense. You will still be hampered by things like their mediocre monks and their generic economy, but I still think it has enough things going for them that I think it keeps them from being like absolutely low tier. Possibly, I kind of consider them being in B tier, and maybe I might consider them, but I think just to be on the safe side, I'm just going to put them on the top of C tier. Chinese is up next in this tier. Like I mentioned with Khmer, it's one of those civs that feels really good when you're facing a civ that doesn't have the units that can kill you. But it feels like bottom tier if you're facing a civ that does. So what kills Chinese, especially on closed maps like this? Halb SO, Halb Onager, Halb SO. It's just a nightmare for Chinese to fight on closed maps because they have basically not a single good counter to that. They don't have bombard cannons. Their monks miss redemption. You know, your cavalry is okay, but it's not fantastic. You know, lacking Hussar kind of hurts in this regard. Lacking Paladin hurts in this regard. And really, the only thing you might try and answer that is maybe like a line of bombard towers. But then that also kind of conflicts with the Chinese game plan, because if you don't go for your Chukunu unique unit, your late game is not really that impressive. So it's just, that kind of army composition just makes things really awkward for Chinese. But otherwise, I mean, they have a nice economy, decent early Imperial Age opening. They're decent at a lot of things, not particularly strong in any one particular thing, but it's just with that very noticeable weakness to like the Halb SO combos. So civs like Celts, which I also like saw recently in, say, Masters of the Circus Dracon's tournament, where Skogo in the finals forced this matchup with Stefan because he knew just how badly Chinese matchup against a civ like Celts with the Halb SO combo. So yeah, I'd say maybe the thing with the comparing Khmer, where I'd say maybe Chinese eco is not quite as good, and they don't have like the raw power that Khmer can have with their scorpions and their elephants. So even though I considered them to be like similar civs in the regard of like good civ if the opponent doesn't have what the units that kill you, bad if their opponent does, it's just a lack of raw power that Khmer has that kind of puts them a tier below like Khmer. Next up is Mongols. The problem with Mongols is always going to be their generic mid-game boom and their weak early Imperial Age. You need Mangadai, you need your Drill Siege in order for you to be a good late-game civilization. And those are really expensive units to tech into, especially off the back of a generic mid-game boom. So again, like some other civs that I mentioned previously, like Celts up in B tier, if you're facing a civ that's really dominant in early Imperial Age, you're gonna lose your castles, you can't even get to Mangadai, and you're gonna die. Or at the very least, your late game is going to be extremely stunted because you don't have a very good backbone if you can't get to Mangadai. So I always like to say, if you're fighting Mongols on Arena and you get to early Imperial Age, if you can destroy 2 of their castles, assuming that the Mongol player has them up, the Mongols are basically already dead there, half dead if not completely dead. So things like Arbalest, BBC, I think that's probably the best kind of generic army composition that's really good at pressuring Mongols in early Imperial Age. But still other things like, you know, Halb Ram Monk or Halb Treb Monk can also do a number on Mongols in early Imperial Age. Things like that. But I will say, I mean, the nice thing about Mongols is that they're also very good at dealing with like Halb Siege army compositions that I really like, assuming you have decent micro with your Mangadai. So if you are able to get up to that late game, you're going to be very happy, but it's very difficult to get there. So I think C tier is a fair position to put them in. Tatars is up next. This is a bottom 3 arena civilization in my last tier list in D tier. But the buff that they received with the extra sheep that they get in Feudal Age, as well as the extra sheep that they get with every new town center that they build, I think is honestly it's been kind of tested out. It's been found to be an incredibly strong eco bonus because you can delay farms for a huge amount of time while you're kind of still running your economy. So Tatars is like one of the few civilizations where you can try doing like a 4 TC boom and be able to get up to have an Imperial Age timing comparable to that of most generic economies, 3 TC booms. and that it just kind of highlights just how strong this civ's economy is at the moment. Likely going to get nerfed by the next patch if I had to guess. I think maybe because it is deemed to be a little bit too strong, especially on open maps. But I think in closed maps, even though the eco itself is good, the Tatars are always going to struggle with the problem of what exactly can they make to be able to translate that. What exactly can they translate that great economy into? And unfortunately, they don't have much. You know, the cav archers are nice, but again, like I said when I talked about Magyars, cav archer is a unit type that excels a lot more on open maps, not so much on closed maps, unless you can find an area that you can onager cut, or maybe your opponent has kind of like over chopped and you can sneak in their economy to raid. It's just not easy to raid with them compared to on open maps. And so, you know, your light cav, your keshiks, your cav archers, all of these units that excel a lot more on open maps. And they don't really have much in the way of like these slow, powerful army compositions, because their infantry is awful, missing 2 blacksmith upgrades. Their siege is mediocre at best, and you know they don't have gunpowder. They don't have bomber cannons either. No, and so it can be rough for them against like the Halb siege civs. But because their eco is just so insane these days, I think I had to definitely put them out of D tier into C tier. Next up is Huns. Very similar to Tatars in playstyle, like the cavalry as well as cav archers. You also have a decent economy because you don't need to build houses, but it can also be a bit of a bane if you're trying to defend. You know, you're gonna have to rely on like your palisades or stone walls because you can't house wall internally. Your late game is very, very one-dimensional because it's very heavily oriented towards cavalry, cav archers, and siege rams. And so again, Halb siege civs I think should just completely end Hun's career. You might have like a decent early Imperial Age push with things like, you know, Halb siege ram, like cav archer and siege ram, things like that. But needless to say, I don't think Huns are just not built for post-Imperial Age, especially not on a map like Arena, where they're just missing so much that makes a good Arena civilization. Next up is Vikings. Yeah, again, the civ that's really polarizing, really good economy, like amazing economy, but it's just, they can't translate it to a whole hell of a lot. Arbalest ram pushing that this civilization is very well known for might still be a really nice strategy on Arabia and other open maps, but on closed maps, I'd say it's pretty damn near an obsolete strategy. Most people these days know it's coming and they know how to deal with it. Internally wall, tech onagers, and just completely stop the push and just kind of play it out as a game of counters from there in post-Imperial Age. And that's just not where Vikings want to be. It's a feudal, castle, and early Imperial Age oriented civilization. Go much further than that and the civ really starts to struggle. In my opinion, Zerks, you know, even after all their improvements that they got from various patches since a couple of years ago, doesn't make the civilization a late game powerhouse civilization. You know, powerful archer or like infantry and siege based civilizations I still think should just completely rip apart Vikings. So for example, Teutons up in S tier, you know, their siege and their infantry, their siege is way better than the Vikings. Their infantry quality is way better than the Vikings. You know, Byzantines with like, you know, cataphracts and dirt cheap elite skirms should also completely rip apart Vikings. Civs like, for instance, Britons in A tier, for example, like the archer and siege civs. Like if they go longbow or arbalest and onager, what can Vikings do? Like I don't their cavalry is god awful. They have no gunpowder. Their monks are trash, like easily a bottom 3 monk civilization. So you're just really not built for the post-Imperial Age, and that's what I'll always believe with the civ, regardless of any opinions about berserks being powerful that I hear. Persians is the third to last C tier civ. Again, much like Tatars and Vikings in the same tier, it's just a really strong eco-civilization that just struggles to translate that great economy into anything super useful. So it's a very cavalry addicted civilization, and cavalry for the most part is just not particularly good to go for on arena, because your ability to be mobile is really stunted compared to on open maps. And with the exception of maybe fighting very archer heavy civilizations, you're probably not going to be finding a ton of use for them. But what I'd say kind of helped Persians, since they're like Warlord kingdoms, where like my very first tier list had them in D tier. What's helped them is the fact that they have a easier time with like their unit transitions, because like let's say you did go for cavalry, you're inevitably going to be running into halberdiers, cavalry counters. And so it was always really rough for Persians, because you're spending a ton of food and gold on your heavy cavalry. But it's like all your good supporting units also cost the same resources. It's just so expensive, like hand cannoneers. But now that they get their new unique tech, or I say new, but it's comparatively new with DE's release. It's been a year. But with a Kamandaran, which allows their crossbow line to cost no gold, you have a really nice kind of complement to your cavalry that you otherwise didn't have before. And you still do have things like bombard cannons that can help with pushing, and like siege rams that can help with pushing. But you're still going to be feeling like if you don't have cavalry with the civ, it feels very lackluster. Your monks are probably the very worst in the game, except maybe with Vikings. They both miss a ton of very important technologies. Siege otherwise is not super great because you miss siege engineers. Your infantry is like, your champ line is awful. You will probably use spear line a lot more, but still it can kind of hurt. And yeah, just a very heavy cavalry focus, and it's basically in a nutshell, not being able to translate your great economy into a really nice like a arena pertinent late game is, I think, what ultimately holds Persians back massively. Next up is Indians. From B tier to C tier, they took a really heavy hit with their nerf well, let's just say it's more of a change. Just so we don't kind of generalize. But their imp camels, they're always problematic in team games because they can just delete paladin pockets, which are just so prominent in team games as well. But in order to do that, the developers, they thought the best course of action this time around was to remove to remove plate mail armor from the civ, and to instead give +1/+1 pierce armor in castle and imperial age for their scout line as well as their camels. So ultimately they want both. So ultimately both unit types, the Hussars winds up with one less melee armor but the same pierce armor. The camels wind up with one less melee and pierce armor, so they're definitely much significantly worse than they used to be. I'd say Indians, it's just always been a very problematic civ, where if you nerf it for one setting, you're also kind of screwing the civ for other civ settings too. And it was already kind of, exception of like one person I know, and I'll just say it's Dark Noob. Having spoken with him, he holds Indians in very high regard, at least A tier, which he just likes them a lot. But most everyone else I know puts Indians in C or D tier. It's just like a civil situation with like Persians, Vikings, Tatars before them. A really nice economy with the cheaper villagers that they just can't take advantage of, because they can't take full advantage of, because their late game options just aren't that impressive. You won't be making use of imperial camels, except maybe if you're fighting against a very cavalry heavy civilization, and you don't have a ton of power otherwise. Elephant archers, kind of a meme unit. The only time you might find some good use for them is against archer civilizations. And even then, most archer civilizations tend to be really strong in early Imperial Age, and elephant archers being a unique unit, it takes a lot of time to get up and running. You may very likely die before you ever get them massed up and upgraded. So Indians, definitely relegated to C tier. I would really love to see some more common sense changes trying to apply to this civilization, like removing +4 defense for cavalry for camel civilization. It just feels so weird to me. and hopefully they can figure something out, because in its current state, Indians just feel like such a weird civilization to play, and fairly weak on Arena specifically, and even on Arabia, as I think a lot of people, like a lot of top players who play Arabia will probably attest to. The final civ in my C tier is going to be Mayans, pretty much in the same spot as they were from my previous tier list. So right on the cusp of being like C and D tier. Yeah, Mayans have just never really impressed me that much on Arena. Ever since like 2 years ago, once like if this was, I'll say, if this was the arena meta of like maybe, I don't know, between like 3 to 5 years ago, I think Mayans you could definitely make an argument for Mayans being an A or even S tier, because Mayans excelled in like that kind of low-ish economy, like a forwarding situation, like you open plumed archers, you take some map control, forward a castle, and like fairly minimal eco, go up to Imperial Age, trap your opponent down, take advantage of your plumed archers, which are can scale fairly well with like minimal upgrades, like just getting Bracer in early Imperial Age. You know, if this was that kind of meta, again, you can make the argument for A or S tier, but this is just not that era of Arena anymore. It's a lot more eco focused. It's a lot more late game focused on average, and that's just not where Mayans shine. Their late game it's cost efficient, but it's nowhere near pop efficient. Eagles and plumes, I think, have a very specific window of time where they're useful, and then the units just fall off a cliff. And you know, Mayans, and outside of those units, the Mayan tech tree just doesn't have a lot of flexibility. In fact, probably no flexibility. You know, there's a lot of holes to their tech tree, and so you know this civ. And if you're facing civs like that have like Champ Onager, like Champ Siege Onager, you can basically just, if you get to the late game stage in the game, if I'm Mayans against those civs fighting that kind of army, I'll probably just resign before I even take an engagement, because I know it's going to be nearly impossible for me as Mayans to come out on top against those kinds of compositions. So Mayans, I still think rightfully in C tier. The meta just has shifted to the point where Mayans, I think, have basically kind of faded out into almost obscurity. They still do have their slight uses. Their economy is nice, and I guess their early Imperial Age can be nice, but that's really about it. D tier. So the civs, mentioned civs that just really are not built for Arena, in my opinion. They just suffer in a lot of different ways. But, you know, it's only going to be 2 civs long. That's a really nice indicator for a civ balance these days. We're almost there. It's almost to the point where I'd say you don't even need a D tier for Arena anymore, but we still have these kind of 2 problem civilizations. So first we have Berbers. Again, very minimal eco bonuses, heavy reliance on cavalry, and just, you know, very weak to these halb and siege compositions in the late game as a result. And, you know, also bad monks. They just have very little to offer for Arena, except just maybe being able to take map control a little bit easier with since your stable units are quite a bit cheaper. But that's really about it. You know, Berbers don't really offer much on this map otherwise. And of course, Goths, still to me the worst Arena civilization overall. Although I will say the caveat is a civ like Goths, it's very volatile in the sense that it can match up very badly against certain civilizations. Like, for example, like Teutons up in S tier, like Aztecs in the same tier. Byzantines maybe as well, especially now that cataphracts are a lot more accessible, and, you know, Goths being such an infantry-reliant civilization. But it can also just completely steamroll other civilizations like Mayans. If you run into Mayans versus Goths, it's really difficult in an evenly matched game. It's really difficult for, I think, Mayans to come out on top. A lot of cavalry-oriented civilizations like Indians and Persians, I think, will also struggle against Goths a lot. And maybe civs like Britons, even in A tier, where they have a very heavy focus on archers. I think Goths can also be a very unpleasant matchup for them. And depending on how they're played out. But then So it's just a very polarizing civ, and so for me anyways, the reason they're still bottom tier for me in spite of those very polarizing matchups is just because I really don't like this civ in any capacity. You know, they're very infantry heavy, they have no eco bonus, and yeah, just very, very one-dimensional and with no eco bonus. And that, in my opinion, just doesn't lend itself very well to Arena. And, you know, Goths, unless they're able to get some kind of like real change that kind of helps maybe some of their other unit lines, like for example their siege or like their cavalry, they're always going to be bottom tier for me and probably always last in my Arena tier lists as a result. But anyway, that's my tier list in a nutshell, or I say in a nutshell, a lot of commentary still, even though it's just going to be one video. So I mean, this is a pretty subjective tier list for the most part. Like I said in my previous tier list, giving commentary, Arena is one of those maps that I think definitely lends itself to where the civ standings lend themselves well a lot more to the players and their various play styles. You know, civs that maybe I put in like B or even C tier could possibly even be like A tier or possibly an S tier for some people, but this is just my kind of subjective take on it. You're always going to have a certain subset, like a few civilizations that are going to be objectively very strong and top tier on Arena, a couple that are going to be objectively very bad on Arena, but a lot of stuff that's in the middle. And for me, this is just my take on the tier list. So hope you guys enjoyed the commentary. Hope you guys enjoyed this tier list. Feel free to agree or disagree. Put some thoughts in the comments if you feel so inclined. And yeah, I'll see you next time.